So, the book 1984. This is one of those ones that you're supposed to read in high school, but oftentimes many don't read, or if you're like me, you just try to do your Spark Notes or whatever, right? I'm not proud of that, okay? So, later on in life, I've gone back and I've read 1984. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about my favorite lessons from 1984, what jumped out at me. Why am I doing this? Well, I've started reading more, and a lot of people have said if you want something to stick, you should teach it, okay? So, this is partially a selfish endeavor. I want this information to stick in my brain. I don't want to have to go back and read 1984 again. So in order to do that, I'm going to try to teach you guys some of my favorite lessons from the book 1984, the things that really jumped out to me. But I think it'll also engender a good discussion, good conversation, and we'll see if in the future it might be worthwhile to do more book reviews or book discussions or things like that, okay? Now, I know many people have not read 1984, so we're going to start out by just going over the plot overview from the Spark Notes, okay? So this is the Spark Notes plot overview. Now, here's the thing. If you haven't read it and you don't want to be spoiled, then you're going to want to leave right now, okay? Like, I'm going to spoil the book. That's what the plot overview does. So I'm going to read through the plot overview, and then we're just going to walk through some of the principles that I think are most interesting. And we'll talk about it as we go, and it's just going to be kind of free-flowing conversation. Let's jump into the Spark Notes plot overview. Plot overview of 1984. Winston Smith, he's our main character, is a low-ranking member of the ruling party in London, in the nation of Oceania. Everywhere Winston goes, even his own home, the party watches him through telescreens, right? Everywhere he looks, he sees the face of the party's seemingly omniscient leader, a figure known only as Big Brother. The party controls everything in Oceania, even the people's history and language. Currently, the party is forcing the implementation of an invented language called Newspeak, which attempts to prevent political rebellion by eliminating all words related to it. Even thinking rebellious thoughts is illegal, thought crime. Such thought crime, in fact, is the worst of all crimes. As the novel opens, Winston feels frustrated by the oppression and rigid control of the party, which prohibits free thought, sex, and any expression of individuality. Winston dislikes the party and has illegally purchased a diary in which to write his criminal thoughts. He's also become fixated on a powerful party member named O'Brien, whom Winston believes is a secret member of the Brotherhood, the mysterious legendary group that works to overthrow the party. So O'Brien is like his confidant, right? He doesn't talk to him because if you talk to each other, everyone's going to know. But he's got this sneaking suspicion, this feeling that O'Brien's a good guy and he's secretly fighting against the government, okay? Winston works in the Ministry of Truth where he alters historical records to fit the needs of the party. He notices a coworker, a beautiful dark-haired girl, staring at him and worries that she is an informant who will turn him in for his thought crime. He believes she works for the thought police. He is troubled by the party's control of history. The party claims that Oceania has always been allied with East Asia in a war against Eurasia, but Winston seems to recall a time when this was not true. Of these three nations, guys, their alliances are always shifting, right? Sometimes Eurasia is allied with Oceania, and sometimes they're the enemy of Oceania. So they're constantly going back and forth fighting. Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia are always in battles with one another. Now, they constantly change the records to demonstrate, oh, we've always been fighting against East Asia, for example, when, again, he knows that's in fact not true, okay? Because he works for the company that changes history, right? They alter historical records. That's his job, okay? The party also claims that Emmanuel Goldstein, the alleged leader of the Brotherhood, is the most dangerous man alive, but this does not seem plausible to Winston. Winston spends his evenings wandering through the poor neighborhoods in London, where the proletarians, or proles for short, live squalid lives relatively free of party monitoring, okay? One day, Winston receives a note from the dark-haired girl that reads, "I love you." She hands it to him in secret. She tells him her name, Julia, and they begin a covert affair, always on the lookout for signs of party monitoring. Eventually, they rent a room above the secondhand store in the Prole district where Winston bought the diary. The relationship lasts for some time. Winston is sure they will be caught and punished sooner or later. The fatalistic Winston knows that he has been doomed since he first wrote his diary entry, while Julia is more pragmatic and optimistic. As Winston's affair with Julia progresses, his hatred for the party grows more and more intense. At last, he receives the message that he has been waiting for. O'Brien wants to see him. Winston and Julia travel to O'Brien's luxurious apartment. As a member of the powerful inner party, Winston belongs to the outer party. O'Brien leads a life of luxury that Winston can only imagine. O'Brien confirms that Winston and Julia, that like them, he hates the party as well. So not only is he well off, he also hates the party. And he says that he works against them as a member of the Brotherhood. He indoctrinates Winston and Julia into the Brotherhood and gives Winston a copy of Emmanuel Goldstein's book. So finally, they've got their in, and they're going to be part of this Brotherhood, this group that's going to overthrow the party, okay? The Manifesto of the Brotherhood. Winston reads the book, an amalgam of several forms of class-based 20th century social theory, to Julia in the room above the store. Suddenly, soldiers barge in and seize them. Mr. Charrington, the proprietor of the store, is revealed to have been a member of the Thought Police all along. So they rented this apartment from Mr. Charrington, and turns out he turned them in. Torn away from Julia and taken to a place called the Ministry of Love. All of the words are backwards here. Winston finds that O'Brien, too, is a party spy who simply pretended to be a member of the Brotherhood in order to trap them into committing an open act of rebellion. O'Brien spends months torturing and brainwashing Winston, who struggles to resist. At last, O'Brien sends him to the dreaded Room 101, the final destination of anyone who opposes the party. Here, O'Brien tells Winston he is forced to confront his worst fear. Throughout the novel, Winston has had recurring nightmares about rats. O'Brien straps a cage full of rats onto Winston's head and prepares to allow the rats to eat his face. Winston snaps, pleading with O'Brien to do it to Julia instead and not him. Giving up Julia is what O'Brien wanted from Winston all along. His spirit is finally broken. Winston is released to the outside world. He meets Julia, but no longer feels anything for her. He has accepted the party entirely, and he has learned to love Big Brother. It's a pretty tough book. This is one of those, futuristic books. Really is not a utopia, but a dystopia, right? You've got this dystopian future. And yeah, he's terrified of rats the whole book. And then at the very end, O'Brien knows that he's terrified of rats, and so he tries to sick the rats on him. Finally, his fear of the rats is too much, and he finally gives up on Julia, his love. Okay? So that's how the book goes, and you can see a lot of interesting ideas tied up in the book. Now, what I did, guys, is I took notes while I read the book of the things that jumped out to me most. And what I want to go do tonight is I just want to go through some of the things and read them to you and discuss them with you and the practical implications they can have for our lives today. Because in many ways, Orwell was warning us against the type of future that could come, the type of future that could be ahead of us if we continued down a very bad path. That's what Orwell was kind of warning against a little bit. And so I want to take some of the principles from the book and I want us to think about them together. And perhaps we can learn something from them. Okay, so that's the idea. Taiwan Tim says, I see no mention of God in the summary. So depressing. And that's part of it, right? There is actually one point in the book where O'Brien, while he is torturing Winston, he actually asks Winston if he believes in God. And Winston says no. So you can kind of actually see one aspect of this book is what a godless world kind of looks like. A world without hope or without a future. Because, again, Winston's being tortured and he's trying to hold out. He's trying to hang on. And O'Brien asks him if he believes in God, and he says no. And he says, then what are you hoping for? What are you hanging on to? And he says, well, the spirit of man. Can you believe that? That's what he hangs his hat on, right? Because he doesn't believe in God, he has to hang his hat on the spirit of man. And, of course, then O'Brien asks him, you're a man, are you not? And yet you are breaking under our torture. So, yes, very, very good eye on that one, Taiwan Tim. So here's what I want to do now, guys. Let's go through 1984 through Tanner's lens. A few things I want to look at. First, I want to look at some of my favorite quotes from the book. Okay, there are these like pithy little sayings. Now, here is one quote from the book, and I want us to contemplate this one. This is the first quote. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Now, here's the idea behind this, guys. The capital, the party, is really involved in rewriting history constantly. They're constantly rewriting history. There's kind of a question like, why? Why do you guys care about rewriting history so much? Well, this quote comes up. He who controls the past controls the future. So what they're saying is if we can rewrite history, we are going to change what is the case in the future. And then the question becomes, well, how do you rewrite history? You must control the present. Okay, so if you control the past, you will control the future. How do you control the past? You do so by controlling the present. This brings up a very important point and idea, and I want us to think about this together. What importance does the past or history have to teach us? What lessons can history teach us that we must not forget? What do you guys think? Because this is a big theme in the book. They're constantly rewriting the past because they think it holds the keys to the future for them. Doozy says it tells us what not to do. Taiwan Tim says, on a positive note, we need to remember the way we got through hard times. I like that. The idea being here, I think there's an old adage or an old saying. It's not actually said in this book, but the idea is similar. And the adage or the saying is, those who forget the past are destined to repeat it. And I think that's an important idea that Orwell is getting at without ever stating it explicitly. Psalm 22 crushed it. We usually learn from our mistakes and learn from history's mistakes to not repeat them. Exactly right. I think we very often don't interact with the past. We don't deal with history very much. We don't engage very much with things that are distant to us because they seem irrelevant. But in reality, these things are very relevant to our lives, and we should absolutely consider them and try to learn from those mistakes. Here is the next quote that I really, really liked from the book. Sanity is not statistical. Now, this comes up in the context when Winston reads the Manifesto for the first time. It begins to affirm all of his ideas and suspicions, and he realizes although he has felt very alone for most of his life, although he has felt very much in the minority, he's finally right. He's finally vindicated. The point being here, guys, that just because something is popular, just because a lot of people believe something, doesn't mean that it's truth. Truth or sanity is not by popular vote. And I think this is important to understand sometimes because we as human beings are so easily swayed and manipulated by groupthink. Well, the group is thinking in this way. It must be true. I should think in that way. A lot of people are saying that this is the case. Well, it must be true. I must be wrong. People are very hesitant to voice their disagreements with the group when it seems like the group is obviously supporting or referring to something, even if they're unsure about it. In fact, I don't have the link for it right now, but I saw a video one time that was talking about groupthink, and it showed a case where there was an individual placed in a group of people, and there was a plant in that group of people, and the plant's job was to persuade everybody that something that was obviously not true or the case was the case. Okay, that was the plant's job. Even if it was obvious or self-evident, they were very easily swayed. Look at this, guys. Group behavior and the power in a social situation. Solomon Asch conducted several experiments in the 50s to determine how people are affected by the thoughts and behaviors of others. In one study, a group of participants was shown a series of printed line segments of different lengths, A, B, and C. Participants were then shown a fourth line segment, X. They were asked to identify which line segment from the first group, A, B, or C, most closely resembled the fourth line segment in length. Each group of participants only had one true naive subject. The remaining members of the group were confederates of the researcher. A confederate is a person who is aware of the experiment and works for the researcher. Confederates are used to manipulate social situations as part of the research design. And the true naive participants believe that confederates are, like them, uninformed participants. In the experiment, in Asch's study, the Confederates identified a line segment that was obviously shorter than the target line, a wrong answer. The naive participant then had to identify out loud the line segment that best matched the targeted segment. How often do you think the true participant aligned with the Confederates' response? That is, how often do you think the group influenced the participant and the participant gave the wrong answer? Asch found that 76% of participants conformed to group pressure at least once by indicating the incorrect line. Conformity is the change in a person's behavior to go along with the group, even if he does not agree with the group. Okay? This is very, very popular. Okay? This is very easy to do. The Confederates would say, no, B is definitely the same length as X. And the person would begin to question themselves, and they would go along with everybody else that it was B. Okay? Because they thought it was just a bunch of unbiased participants. So it's called the Asch effect, where the group majority influences an individual's judgment. The same goes for 1984. In 1984, almost the entire story, Winston believes that he's just a bit crazy. He's got to be insane because things that everybody is acting as though they're self-evident and real, he thinks are obviously wrong. And so Winston questions his sanity almost the entire book until he finally gets the Manifesto. He reads 2 of the chapters, and after he reads the second chapter, which really he went back and read the first, but after he reads that chapter, he puts the book down and he says, sanity is not statistical. It's kind of like a final moment for him where he finally realizes, oh man, I wasn't the crazy one all along. The third quote that I really like, after he reads the Manifesto, Winston says this. He says, the best books to read are those that tell you what you already know. After he reads 2 of the chapters, he explicitly states he didn't learn anything, but they reaffirmed in him some sort of sense that he already had. So that reaffirmation can be very powerful. If we go back to our groupthink experiment with Ash, we recognize that we're very influenced by the opinions of others. Well, that also works in the other direction. Sometimes we have an opinion that we think is unpopular, but we're bolstered by others because they have or share the same opinion as us. I actually think this is true of church communities, and I think this is some of what we are tapping into when we try to build good churches. If you're sitting out there trying to be a Christian by yourself out in the world, like a lone wolf Christian, you might struggle a lot. You might have a lot of difficulties and trials. And it might be one of those situations where you don't have a lot of support and you feel like giving up. But if you're in a community of like-minded believers who believe the same things as you, and they're trying to support you and spur you on and encourage you, you are a lot more motivated to keep on fighting, right? To continue to support. That is, I think, the power of this phrase. And I also thought of the gospel, right? The best books to read are those that tell you what you already know. We already know the gospel, but we continue to read the Bible over and over and over again. And I think that can be good because it reaffirms your concepts, your thoughts, your ideas. Here was another one that I thought was very, very interesting. Until they become conscious, they will not rebel. Until they rebel, they will not become conscious. Very, very interesting quote. They're talking about the proletariat, the proles in the book. And the idea was that they're stuck. You've got this weird chicken and egg scenario. They're not going to become conscious until they rebel, but they're not going to rebel until they become conscious. And you kind of they're in this weird situation. And the point of the teaching is that they don't have what is needed in order for them to ascend or arise to the next level. And you know what this actually reminded me of? This reminded me of our state before God being dead in our trespasses and sins. We're not going to repent until we are regenerated, or we're not going to be regenerated until we repent. That kind of thing, right? And the whole point is, it's in God's hands. We need an outside force to come in and do this work in our hearts and lives. I thought this was a very interesting quote, and it reminded me of that Christian principle of must be born again. And so I thought that was a very, very good point, and it tied into this idea because it seemed like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place and were forever consigned to not make any progress or improve or anything like that because they're not conscious enough to rebel and they don't rebel enough to become conscious. Okay, my final quote that I really liked. This is near the very end of the book while Winston is being tortured. And O'Brien tells him this. He says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. That is O'Brien's perspective, that they're constantly trying to stamp out humanity. They're trying to minimize what makes us human and diminish it to where there's nothing left. O'Brien tells him, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And to me, this actually struck me because I thought, how important is it for us to fight for the image of God in man? How important is that for us, guys? If we lose the image of God that is bound up in man, then we lose ourselves. We lose the future. We lose our opportunity. We lose eternity, really. We cannot afford to lose the image of God. And any teachings that seek to diminish the image of God in man are, in a sense, this boot stamping on the human face. This is very important, guys. Now, I have said before that I don't think a belief in evolution is antithetical to Christianity. But I will say what it does do is it minimizes the image of God in man because we become merely an animal. And if we lose that image of God, guys, that's going to diminish us as a species and as a race. And I think we have seen some people fall into that tendency. I'm not saying evolution of necessity leads to this, but it has certain implications for this that we need to be very careful about. Again, in this society, they're trying to reduce or minimize the image of God in humanity, and they have a boot stamping on the human face forever. We need to be careful that we as a society, we as a culture, we as Christians in the culture, do not minimize man, but exalt him and lift him up as high and lofty, created in God's image as he is. That isn't to minimize his sinful nature, but we need to emphasize his image of God createdness. Okay, very important idea. So those are my favorite quotes from 1984. Now, the next thing I want to do is go into two long-form discussions. And I'm going to actually read portions to you from the book. These are portions I took from the book, and I want to read them to you and give you a little bit of perspective of the idea. So let's jump into the first long form. And what I want you to see here is propaganda, essentially. How propaganda works, okay? And here in the book, there are these constant blasts of information. Constantly, they are blasting information at the people. And they're designed to keep your mind focused on irrelevant things. Fake news, if you will. Now, what I don't want you to conclude is that propaganda is them trying to necessarily deceive you or tell you lies. That is part of it, but it is not the whole thing. Instead, what I noticed about the propaganda that was constantly being spread in the book was that it distracted you. Not that it was a lie, but it just distracted you from things that were really important. That's what I thought was so interesting. And so I want to read a passage to you where the propaganda is really being blasted full force and just talk a little bit about these ideas. This is about middle of the book. They're all at lunch eating, and the telescreen starts blaring out an important breaking news, guys, breaking news announcement. As though in confirmation of this, a trumpet call floated from the telescreen just above their heads. But however, it was not the proclamation of a military victory this time, but merely an announcement from the Ministry of Plenty. "Comrades," cried an eager, youthful voice. "Attention, comrades! We have glorious news for you. We have won the battle for production. Returns now completed of the output of all classes of consumption goods show that the standard of living has risen by no less than 20% over the past year. All over Oceania this morning, there were irrepressible, spontaneous demonstrations when workers marched out of factories and offices and paraded through the streets with banners voicing their gratitude to Big Brother for the new happy life which his wise leadership has bestowed upon us. Here are some of the completed figures. Foodstuffs. The phrase, "our new happy life," recurred several times. It had been a favorite of the late with the Ministry of Plenty. Parsons, this is one of the individuals who Winston feels is very brainwashed. Parsons, his attention caught by the trumpet call, sat listening with a sort of gaping solemnity, a sort of edified boredom. He could not follow the figures, but he was aware that they were in some way a cause for satisfaction. Do you guys see that? Do you guys see that? I feel like that happens so often nowadays. I couldn't follow the figures, but I was aware that in some way it was a cause for satisfaction. He continues. He had lugged out a huge and filthy pipe, which was already half full of charred tobacco. With the tobacco ration at 100 grams a week, it was seldom possible to fill a pipe to the top. Winston was smoking a Victory cigarette, which he had held carefully horizontal. The new ration did not start till tomorrow, and he only had 4 cigarettes left. For the moment, he had shut his ears to the remoter noises and was listening to the stuff that streamed out of the telescreen. It appeared that there had been demonstrations to thank Big Brother for raising the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week. Raising the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week, guys. And only yesterday, he reflected, it had been announced that the ration would be reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that they could swallow that after only 24 hours? Yes, they swallowed it. Parsons swallowed it easily, remember, because he's so brainwashed, with the stupidity of an animal. The eyeless creature at the other table swallowed it fanatically, passionately, with a furious desire to track down, denounce, and vaporize anyone who suggests that last week the ration had been 30 grams. Sim, too, in some more complex way involving doublethink, Sim swallowed it. Was he then alone in possession of a memory? This is Winston thinking to himself again, am I crazy? The fabulous statistics continued to pour off the telescreen. As compared with last year, there was more food, more clothes, more houses, more furniture, more cooking pots, more fuel, more ships, more helicopters, more books, more babies, and more of everything except for disease, crime, and insanity. Year by year and minute by minute, everybody and everything was whizzing rapidly upwards. The announcement from the Ministry of Plenty ended on another trumpet call and gave way to tinny music. Parsons, stirred to vague enthusiasm by the bombardment of figures, took his pipe out of his mouth. Listen to this, guys. This is crazy from Parsons. The Ministry of Plenty's certainly done a good job this year, he said with a knowing shake of his head, just being blasted with all this propaganda from the telescreen. And then notice the contrast that Orwell paints. There's been a razor ration, and nobody can find or buy razors. Notice, back to back, Parsons says, the Ministry of Plenty's certainly done a good job this year, he said with a knowing shake of his head. By the way, Smith, old boy, I suppose you haven't got any razor blades you can let me have. Not one, said Winston. I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks myself. Ah, well, just thought I'd ask you, old boy. Sorry, said Winston. Look at that interesting thing, guys. Here's what I wanted to draw your attention to, though, guys. Are there lies coming out of the teleprompter? Yes, they're lying to them. But I don't think that's the ultimate power behind the propaganda. I think the power behind the propaganda is the distraction that it leaves for those who are listening it. The fact that they think these are the things that are important, rather than the fact that he's had to use the same razor blade for 6 weeks, right? Instead, what's important? Wow, the Ministry of Plenty's doing really, really well, guys. I think this sort of propaganda is very common in our culture and society today. How often are we distracted by so many different things that aren't things that actually matter? Angie, it is lulling them into a new reality of things that don't really matter. That's exactly right, guys. That's exactly right. And here's where I want to hit a little close to home. What really matters in the grand scheme of things for Christians? Make disciples of all nations. That's what we're about. We're about making disciples. We're about God's name being glorified, God being high and lifted up and worshiped and praised as he ought to. How many of us as Christians are really fired up about the election right now? How many of us as Christians are eagerly waiting to see what's going to come out of the litigation? How many of us as Christians are very focused on what's going on in the Supreme Court? How many of us as Christians are thoroughly tied up with whether or not certain people are going to be reelected, certain laws are going to be passed, etc.? Taiwan Tim, close to home, not video game loot, right? How many of us as Christians are tied up with video game loot? And can we get that special sword, that special drop? Okay? I'm not saying that any of these things are bad in and of themselves, but I do think that our media, our culture, and our society has a way of pushing propaganda that distracts us from the things that are really important. You know, this is only, I read one passage. There's another passage where after Winston is brainwashed fully, he's sitting there waiting in an eager anticipation to hear how Oceania had victory over East Asia in Africa. And he knows basically that it's fake. He knows that it's not real. He knows that it isn't even a real story. And yet his whole mind, his whole body is caught up with how is this story going to conclude. And it's very, very interesting because I think we all do the same things. These narratives get put into our heads over what's important, what we need to be focused on. And rarely are those narratives make disciples of all nations, make disciples of all nations, make disciples of all nations. I think the worst thing about propaganda is not that it is lying, but that it is a massive distraction, irrespective of whether or not it's actually true. Okay? So that's one thing that really grabbed my attention when it came to this topic of the propaganda in 1984. Now, here's another interesting one, guys. And I'm throwing this one out there a little bit for open discussion. I don't know that I have an explicit answer on this, but a little bit of open discussion on this. The way that the party seeks to repress human sexuality reminded me so much of Christian purity culture. Listen, unlike Winston, she had grasped the inner meaning of the party's sexual puritanism. It was not merely that the sex instinct created a world of its own which was outside of the party's control, and which therefore had to be destroyed if possible. What was more important was that sexual privation induced hysteria, which was desirable because it could be transformed into war fever and leader worship. The way she put it was this: when you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you feel happy, and you don't give a damn for anything. They can't bear you to feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and the 3-year plans and the 2-minute hate and all the rest of their bloody rot? That was very true, he thought. There was a direct, intimate connection between chastity and political orthodoxy. For how could the fear, the hatred, the lunatic credulity which the party needed in its members be kept at the right pitch, except by bottling down some powerful instinct and using it as a driving force? The sex impulse was dangerous to the party, and the party had turned it to account. Now, here's what I want to ask us about this, guys. We are coming out of a history in the church where purity culture was very, very popular. What purity culture essentially did, whether deliberately or not, was make sexuality seem dirty, gross, rotten, etc. Okay? And that if you catered or fell into sexuality, you had given up your purity, and this was the most vital and important part of your existence, your identity, and your being. Now, here's the reason I'm bringing this up. I have counseled couple after couple who remained virgins until marriage. They were chaste, products of purity culture, and they did a good job. And then they stepped into marriage and could not embrace a healthy sexuality with their partner because it had been, sex and sexuality had been so tainted in their minds for so many years that they continued to have massive problems sexually in their marriage relationships, even though they had been virgins until the day of their marriage, even though they had done all the things that purity culture says you should do. They couldn't get out of their minds that this was bad, dirty, gross, wrong, etc. And as I was reading 1984, I couldn't help but think that the way they expressed sexuality and sought to repress it in people, sought to put it away from people, and for people to not express it, I couldn't help but think that the way the party did this in 1984 is the way that many of our churches have done this over the past 20, 30, 40 years. BJ says, I've heard the story from people over and over again. Being chaste until marriage is wonderful. Purity culture was horrific. I love that balance, BJ. And here's the question I kind of have. How can we get this balance right? We as Christians are seeking to practice sexuality the way that God designed it. But I think because we fear that being honest and open about sexuality is going to open a Pandora's box that we can't close the lid on, I think we tend to suppress and minimize sexuality rather than teaching on it truly and rightly. So my question for you guys is, how do you think we can talk about sexuality within Christianity in a healthy and godly way without promoting or driving this purity culture mindset? I guess, what is the biblical alternative to purity culture? BJ says, purity culture falls into the same trap the world does. It puts an emphasis on sexuality as if it's the defining thing about our lives rather than Christ. But I think what BJ is saying is that the world's view of sexuality and purity's culture's view of sexuality makes the actual same mistake. And their mistake is that they put the measure somewhere on this line. But they both are emphasizing your identity as a sexual creature as primary, as essential. And I think what BJ and Vector and Rhizone are saying is we should instead tell people not to be confined to this mere horizontal continuum to run back and forth along, but instead that we should be putting it way over here, where maybe I could put something like this. We need to emphasize people's identity in Christ, irrespective of their sexuality, sexual preference, or anything like that. How does that sound, guys? Is that more along the lines of what you guys are talking about? We are making the same argument as the world in purity culture because we are telling people to identify themselves by this line, when in reality, we want to completely displace your identity. Now, the reason I bring this up again is because as I was reading the book, when it was described how the party repressed sexuality, it sounded exactly like purity culture to me, guys. And I was reminded of those couples that I've counseled who struggle to this day with sexuality in their marriage because they have been fed misinformation about the topic. So that I wanted to use this as a springboard to try and encourage us not to have an authoritarian view of sexuality. That does not mean that we reduce or diminish the Bible's teachings on human sexuality. Quite the contrary, people need to have good teaching on this topic. But I think in the church, we love to overemphasize this sin or this issue as the chief of sins, and it orients people's identity horizontally along this axis, rather than forcing them to think of their identity in completely contrary terms, i.e. in Christ. Very nice, guys. Thanks for your input on that. It puzzled me as I read the book and I ran across that, and that's why I wanted to share it. Okay, finally, guys, 3 ideas. 3 ideas from 1984. 3 ideas from the book. 1 was the attempt to freeze history. Once the ruling class got into power, they tried to freeze history and stop advancement. Stopping technological advancement for the sake of leaving things where they're at. And in my opinion, this is nearly always bad. We had read in this channel an old book where they had developed, it was like a weaving machine they had developed, and it allowed people to weave like 4 times faster. And the king put a huge tax on transporting these machines because it was going to hurt his business. To me, that's similar to what they tried to do in 1984. In 1984, they got to a certain level of technological innovation and advancement, and they tried to freeze history and stop any further advancement because it's when they were in power. And this strikes me as a very evil thing to do. I think human beings should always be for technological advancements and processes that improve the human condition, provided they aren't inherently evil in and of themselves. Right? If we can come up with technological advancements and processes that aren't inherently evil in and of themselves, that are more efficient and improve mankind's condition, I think we should be for them, irrespective of who's in power and how it affects us. That's just a general idea I have, and I was very interested how they tried to freeze history while they were in power. The other idea that I thought was very interesting is when Winston finally starts interacting with the rebellion, essentially, he begins to get an idea of something beyond himself, i.e. fighting for the future. Rather than fighting for himself, he wants to fight for the future. And in fact, they tell him, look, you're probably going to get caught and die soon, but it's for the good of the future generation. And Winston is all for it. And this reminded me of the fact that we are so short-sighted in our current day and age. We are very myopic, and we focus on instant gratification and what's it going to do for me. And I think we as Christians especially need to be looking forward to the future, to future generations, to children, and trying to set them up for success down the road. Fighting for the future, I think, is a foreign concept to many. And in reality, it should be very important to us as Christians. The final thing that I noticed was that there were 2 approaches to the knowledge that Julia and Winston had of the deception that they were undergoing. Julia saw all of the deception, but she essentially had this approach. It's all fake. Who cares? Carry on with your life. This is a small excerpt. Except where it touched upon her own life, she had no interest in party doctrine. He noticed that she never used to newspeak words except for those ones that had passed into everyday use. She had never heard of the Brotherhood, and she refused to believe in its existence. Any kind of organized revolt against the party, which was bound to be a failure, struck her as stupid. The clever thing was to break the rules and stay alive at the same time. So Julia's attitude, she's like, yeah, we're being tricked, we're being deceived. It's all fake, and I know we're being deceived. Here's the trick for Julia. I'm going to do whatever I want to do and that I can get away with. But I don't have any higher obligation or authority to let other people know about the deception, to concern others, or anything like that. Julia essentially says, look, I know the rules, and I know how to break them safely without getting myself into trouble. I'm going to keep doing that. I don't have any further obligation to anyone else. This struck me as a disengagement approach to the knowledge of her deception. She knew she was being deceived, and she chose to disengage from the situation. This is in marked contrast to Winston's perspective. And I'm going to give 2 examples. Winston's perspective, he alters history. That's his job. And he had a situation where he had a photograph that was documented evidence that the party was altering history. And he kept telling her about this photograph. And he kept saying, man, if I still have this photograph, then I could use it to have verifiable proof that the party is lying to all of us. And of course, Julia's approach is, who cares? What are you going to do with that? And Winston's approach was essentially, what do you mean, what am I going to do with that? I can maybe convince others. I can warn them. I can teach them. And maybe they will come to a knowledge of the truth, and we can create a movement or a revolution. Winston also, when he finally got the book, when he finally received the Manifesto, he read it voraciously. He was slurping it all up. He just loved the Manifesto. And he tried to read portions of it to Julia, and Julia constantly fell asleep because she just didn't care. She knew it was all a lie, but she was just trying to get on with her life anyway. Whereas Winston felt, rather than disengagement, that they should engage and they had an obligation to tell others the truth. This strikes me as the two generalized approaches to Christ and culture. The counterculturalist perspective essentially says we're to disengage from the culture. The culture is Satan's realm. It's his territory. We're not going to make any substantial strides there. Let's leave that to Satan and let's focus on building the church. That's what the counterculturalist says. They're kind of like Julia. The transformationist says we need to get out there and tell people the truth. We need to engage with the culture and society. We need to get involved and active, and we need to spread the truth as many places as we can and engage everywhere that we can. This is essentially Winston's approach. The transformationist thinks that they have an obligation, a duty, and an authority that they need to bring to the culture to warn them. And we're not talking gospel stuff here, guys. Counterculturalists and transformationists both believe in the gospel and in evangelism. But what we're talking about is general engagement with the church. And it struck me that Julia is much more counterculturalist and bent, and Winston is much more transformationist and bent. And the interesting thing is I don't know that either person is right or wrong. I will say Winston's approach got him essentially killed. Julia would have went on just fine and never been caught, I think, if she continued in her disengagement counterculturalist model. And that might be the case for many churches today, that if they just focus on what they're doing, preaching the gospel and evangelizing, they stay out of political affairs, they stay out of all of the whole 9 yards, they stay out of all that stuff, and they just focus on their little church community, they're liable to survive longer in terms of not coming in under any hot water or fire. But it's also a very insular movement that doesn't reach very many people. Winston's approach, on the other hand, reached a lot more people, but because of that, it caught a lot of negative attention and energy, and it ultimately resulted in him being caught and brainwashed. So I don't know that any is better or worse. I personally am a transformationist, but it was very interesting to see their two approaches to the knowledge of their deception. Julia essentially wanted to keep it to herself and not let anyone know about it and just live her life, whereas Winston wanted to shout it from the rooftops, essentially, and get active and involved, and it led to disaster. That's it, guys. That's my analysis of the book, 1984. All the things that jumped out at me, the things that I thought were most interesting, and I really enjoyed the book. I don't think we should take it as a prophecy or anything like that. It's not infallible, but it's designed to make you think and to grab your attention. And I think it's written in such a way that many of its principles are relevant for our time today. Hey guys, Pastor Channer here, and if you enjoy our content, would you please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons down below? It helps very much. In addition, if you would like to get more involved in our communities, you can do so in the links down in the description to both our Twitch and our Discord channels. We'd love to see you there. Take care. God bless. Bye now.